All right, there. Welcome back. Good to be with you once again. This is the next installment of our ethics course here this semester. So I hope that you've been doing really good since the last time you were here on this YouTube channel or watching this video series. We're continuing to work through our notes right now on the unit of the course that we're in the middle of, which is animal ethics. And I'm just starting off today by going over a couple of points of summary to kind of review just a couple of the topics that we've lectured on in the last few lectures. So, after looking at a whole bunch of other interesting ethical debates and concepts as we started the class, ethical theory to begin, then we moved on to the ethics of abortion, and we spent some time talking about the morality of drug policy and recreational use and prohibition, briefly studied and considered genetic engineering and human cloning and the ethical implications of that biotechnology. And then we looked at war, terrorism, and torture, which finally led us to where we are now, and that is the debate concerning the moral status of animals and to a lesser extent the environment. So we've reviewed a whole bunch of different authors, well, at least two or three, who've tried to make and stake out various positions concerning the question of whether we have moral obligations to refrain from using animals for human purposes, or at least questions pertaining to the morality of certain practices involving them, whether that's animal agriculture or animal biomedical experiments, and things like that. We know that there's this concept of the moral community, the set of beings with full and equal rights, or at least a set of beings that have moral standing or consideration. Another way of trying to capture that concept is to talk about the moral status that a thing has or does not have. A thing which has moral status, another way of putting the concept of membership in the moral community could be to say that something which has moral status is entitled to some level of consideration and respect. So that means that you'd have to think about its interests or something in any of your interactions which involve that thing. And me and you, as humans, adults humans, we clearly do have a moral status, and it's backed by all kinds of traditions, laws, customs, that people can't be harmed or exploited without it violating our both moral and legal norms. But then there are some things that we don't think have the same moral status, or at least the general practice of most of us is to not treat them as though they have the same moral status, because there's a lot of animals, as you know, that are used for meat, clothing, and other experiments to serve human purposes, and that of course cost the animals their lives, and their pain and suffering often is significant in all these practices too. So the question could be, well, do they have a moral status? Or if they don't, why not? How far does the concept of moral status extend? What is it predicated on? And we've seen authors with different views. The traditional view of the West and for most of the world is that overall animals, non-human animals, don't have a significant moral status that can be justified in a variety of ways. There's the traditional, I guess, biblical justification, which, at least in the Abrahamic traditions, advises man to dominate and subdue nature for his purposes and benefit. There's obviously the distinction in those same sacred texts between beings created in the image of God versus those that aren't, and so on. But aside from that more theological justification, there's been a lot of secular philosophy written that makes similar arguments. Some people say that it's because they lack rationality. Some people say that it's because they lack a soul. Maybe that's also a little theologically influenced. Some people say that it's because they lack the capacity for, entering into contracts or making claims. So on the other hand, some people believe that none of these distinctions between them and us are actually relevant. The only real relevant question is whether they can suffer or whether they have any interests in common with our own. So one author that was on the pro-animal side and had a more utilitarian framework of thinking was Peter Singer, who said that we should respect interests equally if they're the same kind of interests, no matter what being it is that possesses it. So he says, let's live by the equal consideration of interest principle, which says that you should give equal consideration to the like interests of all those affected by your actions. And concerning us and animals, sure, we don't have all the same common interests. For example, those that are too intellectually sophisticated for them to understand, like an interest in voting or practicing your religion or your freedom of speech or marriage rights. But they can and do, he thinks, have an interest in avoiding pain and suffering, and that's a common interest that we also have. So he thinks that we should give equal consideration to animal interests in avoiding pain and suffering as much as to humans on a utilitarian basis. Pain and pleasure has to be always evaluated in determining what's right or wrong to do. So he thinks we should consider their pains and pleasures as well. And if we did, he doesn't think we could support certain practices, like at least the heavily industrialized factory farm system of animal agriculture, which to produce cheap and abundant supplies of meat to the consumer cuts a lot of corners on animal treatment and welfare, as they suffer a lot through their lives prior to slaughter and everything else. So he thinks that we should boycott those types of industries. His view is utilitarian in nature, though. So if the animals were made to be painlessly euthanized and lived comfortable lives without pain, then that would kind of bypass the moral force of his argument, because he doesn't say that they have absolute rights to live, but rather that their pain and pleasure should be judged equally with our own. But even if that's so, he doesn't think that you can, for example, as a utilitarian, justify minor and non-essential pleasures of the palate and balance that against major suffering and pain interests of the animals, because again, he'll argue that the use of animal products for food, for example, is neither necessary nor even, in some cases, conducive to long life or health or longevity. He also says that animal experiments cannot be justified, and anybody who gives unequal consideration to the like interests of different beings simply because they're a member of a different species, he would call that speciesism. He thinks that we practice speciesism in overall terms in society when we use food made by animal products or meat, and also when we use them in certain experiments, which he characterizes as being especially brutal for the sake of knowledge that's either non-essential or has already been developed in the past. So that's the sole sort of collection of ideas of Singer. Of course, he did discuss objections too, but we don't have to review those yet again. On the other hand, last time we studied more of the anti-animal arguments of both Carl Cohen and Immanuel Kant. And they had, of course, a diametrically opposed view. Carl Cohen, in his paper from, I believe it's 1989, The Case for the Use of Animals in Biomedical Experiments, he says, to start off, that it's a false assertion to say that animals have rights that are being violated when they are, for example, used in practices like animal experiments. And I suppose he would also include that they don't have rights with respect to the treatment that they endure for the sake of being used for meat. Why don't they have rights, according to Cohen? Because he says that in order to have rights, it's not enough just to be a living thing. It's not enough just to be capable of feeling pleasure and pain. Rather, he thinks to hold rights, you would have to be able to make moral claims, because he thinks that rights simply are claims which can be made and responded to within a community of moral agents. So it's humans that can make claims of a right having been violated or abridged, and then seek restitution or compensation of some kind for the fact that the right was broken or violated. So if your property rights are violated, there's a system in place to make claims to have the issue resolved. And similar with other rights, if you're attacked, then we hold people accountable in courts. And we also have informal systems of moral accountability to one another. So we both respond to and are capable of making our moral claims. That's why, according to Cohen, we have rights. And that's what it requires for you to have rights. But he says animals lacking in this ability for free moral judgment and the ability to either make or react to the moral claims of other beings couldn't possibly have rights. So he's comfortable then saying that there's no moral basis to not make use of these animals, especially for important scientific knowledge that we can derive in biomedical experiments, especially. He then switches gears to a more utilitarian framework of argument. The first part is a little more Kantian, as we know from the points that I'm going to make mention of in just a minute. Kant says that animals, we have no direct duties to them because they lack rationality and they don't understand the moral law. So that kind of idea that lacking in reason, lacking in the ability to understand duty and the reciprocity of rights and duties, unable to understand those things, these animals would then be locked out of the moral community, and we could use them as a means to an end, unlike rational beings who Kant says we should never use in those ways or treat as a means. But Cohen, kind of inspired by those ideas of Kant, in his first part of the essay, he does say that stuff about how they can't make moral claims. A claim, a viewpoint, an argument that does involve some reference to the intellectual capacities or lack thereof of the animals, and that debars them from having rights or being members of the moral community. But the second part of Cohen's essay, he goes into a kind of more utilitarian frame of argument where he says, if you just consider the total sum of the benefits that derive from these animal experiments, and you even deduct from that the pain and suffering of the animals, you will still get a bigger total balance of overall happiness in that case where you're using them than in the case where you desist from using the animals, so their suffering is not going to happen in that case. But we would also lose all these benefits that would not otherwise be achievable if not for the use of animals. So why may they be used in the experiments as a means in the first place? Because they have no rights, because they can't make moral claims. And setting that aside, what's the balance of benefits versus costs, even weighing their pain into the equation? And he thinks on that utilitarian score, you could also just say that it's almost an obligation to use them for these tests, since we get such massive benefits. So he characterizes the value of the experiments in a way much differently from Singer. Singer was kind of going out of his way to say these experiments are often extremely painful for the sake of knowledge that's minimal or unnecessary. And Cohen puts it as though without these animal experiments, there's so many vaccines, medicines, surgical procedures, prosthetic devices, and so forth that could have never been easily developed otherwise. And that adds up to a lot of total utility and overall happiness and reduction of pain. So that's Cohen's view. He kind of affirms towards the end that he's comfortable saying he's a speciesist because maybe it is not weighing equally the interest of animals to avoid pain as we would weigh the interest of humans to avoid pain. But here, the discrimination in the favor of our own kind is justified because we are literally superior to the animals because we have this ability for free moral judgment and making moral claims. He thinks speciesism is not at all comparable to the problems that you have with like racism, sexism, and other forms of human bigotry and discrimination, because in those cases, the being discriminated against by one group is in all relevant respects equal to the group that's doing the discrimination. But if it's humans versus animals, the distinction between the two categories could be argued to be said legitimate on the basis of actual and verifiable, cognitive and other moral differences between us and them. Now, after that, we just briefly touched base with Kant at the conclusion of last lecture. Immanuel Kant himself has some detailed and very, I think, clear views about animal ethics. So he says that with respect to our non-human animal out there, non-human animals, we have no direct duties to them. And he says that's because they are not self-aware, not self-conscious, not rational. They don't have awareness of the moral law. So he says they may be used as a means for the purposes of man, unlike full-blown rational beings like ourselves who you should never treat as a means. So it's because they lack rationality and awareness of the moral law and so forth. That's why he says they're not members of the moral community. But he does say that we have indirect duties to the animals, and that's an interesting kind of subtle twist on his view. He says we have indirect duties to be kind and not unnecessarily cruel to them within the extent practical, because if we indulge in unnecessary cruelty and hostility to the animals, like if we're abusive to them for no reason at all, then in that case, we will become hardened and we will develop tendencies to become just cruel and harmful even to other humans. So he thinks as an indirect duty toward mankind, we should practice kindness and gentility on the animals. Otherwise, again, we will cultivate behavioral tendencies and habits that will ultimately show themselves out in our dealings with humans, where it would actually make would morally be significant then. So he says if a person has an old dog that has helped them hunt, but now it's too old to help them anymore, outlived its usefulness, if the person just shot their dog because they've no longer served a value to them, he says that would be cruel. And it's that kind of behavior of cruelty toward them that would make them likelier to hurt other human beings at least some time down the line. So for the sake of the humans, we should be kind to the animals. But he also says that if there's an important enough purpose behind the cruelty, like, for example, the use of the animal for biomedical information in experiments or for food or clothing or what have you, he would say, well, in those cases, the cruelty can be justified because the aim itself that they're being put toward is praiseworthy, which is purposes that are important to man. But cruelty for sport, he thinks, or for mere amusement, he doesn't think that that is easy to justify morally, even though we don't have a specific duty to the animals not to do that. It would poison our, character and temperament, and therefore make us likelier to be harmful to people. He makes a quote that you can judge the heart of a man by his treatment of non-human animals, and that we should practice kind treatment to dumb animals or something like that, so that we maintain our fine treatment of other people. As he says, get the specific quote, tender feelings toward dumb animals develop humane feelings toward mankind. Okay, so now we come to our next author in the series. I'm just starting with a little review for you guys. The new author for today is another of the pro-animal authors. So we're swinging back to the other side again of the pendulum, looking at a pro-animal argument and position from the author, Tom Regan. Okay. Well, Tom Regan recently passed away, but he was kind of a big name in the animal ethics field of moral philosophy. And this paper is a paper of his from 1983. It's a pretty classic paper. It's called The Case for Animal Rights. Okay, so 40 years ago, this paper came out. And here we are. We're going to talk about it again today. Case for Animal Rights. Tom Regan, 1983. Okay. So Regan, he's on the same kind of side as Peter Singer was, arguing in favor of moral status for animals, but he goes farther than Singer does. We could say that he's even a little more on the side of animals in a way, because he doesn't just say that they have some level of consideration that should be shown to them because they can suffer, and that their pain should be and their interest in avoiding pain should be judged equivalent to our own. He says beyond that the animals actually have rights. Having rights goes beyond the more minimal idea that they have some degree of moral status depending on their capacities for pain and suffering. To him, any being that is got sensations, that can feel things, that can have experiences, is the subject of a life. And anything that is the subject of a life, he thinks, on that basis alone, it has inherent moral value and should be treated as though it has rights and has dignity and should be given respect. So a couple of things then to add to our notes as we start this discussion about Tom Regan. Okay, so let's get a few points out there. What's the subject of a life? So this is his terminology or term, and it is this criteria or quality that Regan believes qualifies something to be a member of the moral community with full and equal rights. So they just have to be not rational, not able to make moral claims, nothing of that intellectual sort. It's just being the subject of a life. So having consciousness, sensation, and a subjective point of view. So this is my little attempt to kind of characterize and make more definite his description of this feature of a thing. If a thing is the subject of a life, it's not, for example, an inanimate object. It's a thing that is conscious. It has consciousness. And according to that idea, it would be able to perceive and have sensations of things. So, like how we can see, taste, touch, hear, and smell. We have the five senses. A being that is the subject of a life would have some form of perception and be able to sense its environment. It would be conscious, and also it would have a point of view. It would see things from a first-person point of view. So obviously you watching this lecture, you have your first person point of view. It's directed at this screen. But suppose that you're a non-human animal out there, a bird, a dog, a cat, or anything, right? You'd also have your own set of eyes and ears and so forth. And you'd have your own sense organs and your own ability to like look around and perceive the world. You might not be able to think about it with language or to write things down using symbols or whatever, or to build tools or any sophisticated actions like that. But you would at least have some cognitive behavior and activity in the brain. So anything that is conscious, which can perceive and sense and has some type of point of view, that's the subject of a life. This marker is not the subject of a life. It's not perceiving anything. It's not, taking in the lecture or not able to, hear or see what we are doing. But you and I are subjects of a life. The point of Tom Regan is that it's not only us that are these subjects of a life. All the non-human animals, or at least many of them, could be put in that same category. And so he says this is the qualifier for membership in the moral community, just merely being the subject of a life. It should not be dependent on something more higher level or cognitively or intellectually sophisticated than that. Now, in his view, anything that is the subject of a life should have or should be considered to have inherent moral value, inherent moral worth. So I need to now talk to you guys all about the difference between inherent value and instrumental value. Okay. Two types of value. So first off, inherent value. Inherent value. What does that mean? Okay, so if a thing has got inherent value, that means it has value in and of itself, regardless of its usefulness to anyone else. Okay, so so what I wrote was inherent value, that is, value that a thing has in and of itself, regardless of its usefulness to anyone else. Okay, so if a thing has inherent value, that means that regardless of anyone else's interests in this thing, it has value on its own. It's not only valuable as a tool to be used for someone else's benefit, it's not only valuable as long as it serves someone else's interests, it's valuable on its own account by itself inherently, meaning like in itself. On the other hand, there's another type of value, okay? So let's get that out there, and then I'll give you examples of both. So we have inherent value right there. The other main type of value that is compared against that, contrasted with it really, because it's different, is not inherent value, but instrumental value, okay? So instrumental value is kind of the opposite. It's value a thing has, but only as a means to an end, okay? So instrumental value is value that something has when it's only useful as a tool or an instrument to get to some other thing that is of value. So an instrumentally valuable thing is not valued for itself. It's valued as the tool or the instrument that it is, the way that it can serve some purpose for someone else. So an end, as you know, is a goal, and means are the things that you use to get to these goals. If a thing has instrumental value, then its whole value is just on the basis that it can be used to get to something that you have in mind as a goal. Okay, so we've talked now about inherent value in itself, regardless of its usefulness to anyone else. as opposed to instrumental value, which is value as a means to an end. Compare those two things. This marker, let's use it as another easy example just because it's right here. Does it have value? Sure, a little bit. They're not exactly free. They do cost, even monetary-wise, a little bit of money in a pack of markers. You could buy a dry erase pack. But, question. Suppose this marker that I'm holding here, which I'm writing notes with, as you know, suppose it runs out of ink, so it's no longer useful for the purpose of writing. At that point, what do you think I ought to do with it? Protect it, keep it, because it doesn't matter if it no longer has any utility. It's valuable in its own. No, of course not. I will throw it away because its whole value is just insofar as it's useful to what end? To the end of writing. It's only valuable as a means to that end. But if it can no longer serve that end, if it can no longer be used as a means to writing and as a writing utensil, then it has no value of its own, and at that point you may as well destroy it because on its own, internally, it's got no inherent value. On the other hand, though, what about you and me, or other human beings? Do we have only an instrumental, or do we have inherent value? And in that case, I would hope your intuition just kind of aligns with, of course, we have inherent value. Suppose that you were to get into some terrible accident and you can no longer be a productive member of society in the sense of like working a job or like paying bills and stuff. Now you actually become a dependent and you're receiving government assistance to support you through your disabilities and stuff because you no longer work. We don't say to a human being that when they cost more than they bring in, they're a net negative on the system, and so we should just eliminate them or whatever, because we believe human beings have inherent value, right? Even somebody who's done some pretty bad things, even if they have not committed a capital crime and they're going to be executed or whatever, we keep people alive. We don't just discard them because we say, well, you're a menace to society and you're not helping us all be happy, so let's get rid of this just expendable thing. We think of humans as having inherent value and dignity. So even if they are a net negative in terms of making people happy, we would still value them and protect them and so on, because of our sense that human beings are not just objects or instruments to be used for other purposes, but they're valuable in and of themselves. So look, some things have an instrumental value, like literally instruments like these. Some things have inherent value, like you and me. I mean, and then the question is, do non-human animals, which category of value do they have? They have some value, of course, but is it only insofar as they could be used by humans for food, for experiments, for clothes? Or do they have value in and of themselves inherently, regardless of their usefulness to anyone else? They should be valued on their own account. This author, Regan, makes the case, which now I'm sure you can sort of anticipate, that they have inherent value because they are subjects of a life. So his argument goes that any being which is the subject of a life, merely being the subject of a life, that is being conscious and having perception and sensation, having just your own point of view, maybe being self-interested about living and not being in pain, anything which has that quality of being the subject of a life, he thinks that's the sort of thing that gives you membership in the moral community, the thing that makes you a holder of rights that should be given fair and equal treatment as any other member of the moral community which has rights. So if you're a subject of a life, you should have inherent value accorded to you. And that means that you should not be looked at as something to be used just for our purposes, but looked at as a valuable item in and of itself with all the rights that pertain to that status, just as we enjoy. Okay? So since we all have this inherent moral value, since we qualify it and animals and other subjects of a life would also, according to him, he would think that we have these rights equally. And if you're a believer in the concept of rights, as we've learned in other lessons, it's typically argued that rights take priority over utility. Rights trump utility. And if rights are more important than utility, then even if there were big utilitarian benefits that we could gain from making use of something as a means, we should not do so because it's a violation of rights, and rights are more important than maximizing overall happiness. For the same reason that, even if stealing from the rich and giving to the poor created more net utility, most people would think it's wrong because they have a right to the property or wealth that they accumulate. Or how if slavery could somehow theoretically just create more economic benefits than costs, it still would be wrong, regardless of how much these benefits could be, because it's violating human rights and dignities. So rights seem to take priority over utility, and he argues that animals have this right status because they're generally subjects of a life. So since they are, their rights could not be set aside because, for example, they get us really a lot of meat, or because they get us really a lot of medical information about experiments that we conduct on them. If they have rights not to be treated that way, then these rights should hold precedence over any utilitarian benefits that could be generated from using them otherwise. So one easy way to think about his position is to sort of put it in this way. If you think something intuitively would be wrong to do to a mature human being, and that would be a violation of that human's rights, then he says that would also be wrong to do to non-human animals. So killing, holding in captivity against their will, subjecting to experiments that could be painful or even fatal without their permission. So in his view, he's got a very kind of radical position, even I would say more pro-animal, a little more to the extreme than Singer, because Singer said that as long as you obtained meat that wasn't produced through factory farming and the animal's suffering wasn't significant, or perhaps didn't happen at all, it wouldn't be a violation of his particular argument to use them as means, as long as they were not made to suffer, because it's all about pain and suffering for him. But this author, Regan, goes farther. He says we should not hunt, eat, dissect, or abuse them, nor do research or farming, even if the farming was traditional farming on a small scale, where the animal never suffered a day of its life. Because at the end of the day, even if you just use their carcass for meat after they are painlessly slaughtered, it's still using them as a means. It's still using them as an instrument, a thing that's only valuable as a resource for something else. And he's arguing they should not be looked at as resources, but rather as being inherently valuable and having inherent dignity and rights. If we don't do that, he says, then we're violating their rights and treating them as though they're only things that have value as resources to us. So to exclude them from the moral community based on low intelligence, for example, he says that would be just as much wrong to do to them as it would be to do with similar human beings, which also have rights. That point overlaps a little bit there, I guess, with some Peter Singer argumentation, because Singer said the same thing, that any attempt to exclude animals from the realm of moral concern solely on the basis that they lack certain intellectual capacities makes no sense, because we don't think that humans which lack the same capacities, for example, the severely mentally disabled or infants, we don't deprive them of their moral status on that account. So he thinks, to be consistent, you wouldn't say that that's a criteria to exclude animals either. Okay, so Regan, the case for animal rights. Again, his position is bold. He says that if animals have rights, then we should completely abolish all forms of animal research, animal agriculture, and hunting. And that's taking a more kind of strict line than some people in the pro-animal camp. He's not just saying that animal agriculture could be okay if it was done traditionally on spacious farms where the animals were not made to suffer, or that the research would be okay if it was just for something very, very, very vital and important that we could not obtain in another way. To him, you cannot change an unjust institution just by reforming the unjust institution. You have to instead more radically abolish it. Okay, so let me kind of elaborate on that point just a little bit. If there's an institution that's unjust, that violates rights, his argument is that you cannot make that institution better. You just have to eradicate it altogether. You can't try to make it more improved or more equal, because if it's unjust, then there's something fundamentally wrong with it at the core of the whole institution. So as an example, take segregation. There was a time period where there was this push to try and maintain the segregated institutions in our country, but to just give them equal funding and equal amenities. So that was the whole separate but equal doctrine, that we could have segregated schools as long as they were each teaching the same subjects and they had the same good standards for education, or we could have segregated lunch counters or segregated housing and stuff, as long as the options were equivalent on both of the sides. But you cannot improve on the institution of segregation by just giving more equal funding to segregated institutions. The fundamental flaw with the whole concept is the premise itself that people should be wardened off into their own racial enclaves and not mixed with each other. That concept itself is pernicious. And so you will never effectively reform this institution of segregation. Rather, you just have to eliminate it and eradicate it completely. And the same thing he's trying to say here about our practices with respect to the animals. He says, animal exploitation by human beings in terms of meat or experimentation or hunting, you can't make it better just by saying, well, let's give them more straw, or let's give them a bigger feedlot to roam around, or let's just expose them to a little less pain and suffering, or even significantly less pain and suffering throughout their lives. Because in his view, the root concept that they're just resources is the fundamental problem with the institution, which makes it unjust. And so in his view, radical abolition of these institutions is the moral imperative that we have, not just to, make them more humane. Because at the end of the day, if we think that they're resources and that they're only instrumentally valuable, then how will we ever treat them properly? How can you ever give fair treatment to something that is property rather than as something that has its own inherent value? So again, to him, you cannot change an unjust institution just by cleaning it up a little bit. Just as if segregation would be okay if we made sure that the segregated institutions were equal and well-funded, of course, that wouldn't be okay. The thing that's wrong with the institution, as he argues, is not a minor detail, but the whole system itself. The basic wrong in the case of animal ethics, he says, is the very idea that animals should be thought of as just simple resources here for us to manipulate at our will, for sport, for taste, or for medical and other scientific knowledge. Once you accept the idea that they're just instrumentally valuable, he says, from there, all the other abusive practices will follow as a logical result. Because, of course, if something's mere property and its interests don't have to be considered, how can you weigh the interests of property equally with the property owner? The property owner who wants to make use of these animals for commerce and for other market-based interests is never going to be turned back because the animal's interests are significantly negatively impacted. So he thinks that the abusive practices will always, exist for as long as this fundamental false moral assumption persists, which is that animals are merely instrumentally valuable. Now, more space, more straw, he says, for example, would not eliminate this fundamental and basic unjust aspect of the practices we're looking at. So in his kind of very strident view, it wouldn't be enough for us to get on the right side of our ethics when it comes to animal treatment to simply be more humane. To do the right thing, he thinks, we have to more radically abolish these practices and institutions of animal agriculture and farming, hunting, and sport. How to do that is a practical question. And he knows that just writing a philosophy article is not going to somehow radically shift place of everyone's view and lead to, a vegetarian or vegan world where we abolish all these practices full stop. But he does say that the only way anyone would ever change their habits, if they already have these habits, is to change their minds, because you will never change your behavior if you didn't think first that it was the right thing to do. So in his view, moral philosophy has at least some kind of subsidiary role to play in helping move progress and change on animal treatment, because more people reading and thinking about these issues ethically will perhaps have at least some initial motivation to reconsider some of their dietary and other consumer choices involving the animals. So that's where he thinks his essay and advocacy in the philosophy world does have at least some ability to have an impact practically, because it might make some people even on some level believe in the necessity for a moral change to the status quo, and then maybe could act in accordance with their feelings there. So anyway, he next considers, how has the moral status of animals been understood by those that deny animal rights? So as many philosophers do, he proceeds next to kind of take on the views of his opponents and critics, and he tries to just demonstrate where he finds flaws with their reasoning. So views from those who deny animal rights. Okay, so He's arguing in favor of these animal rights for the reasons we've already mentioned in this lecture, that he thinks any subject of a life should be considered to have inherent moral value, and if you have inherent moral value, you have it equally to all others who have it, and should be given the same kind of rights, respect, and treatment. Now, why are there some people who don't feel this way? Why is it perhaps that the majority of people don't feel the way that he does about the existence of animal rights? Well, some people hold the indirect duty view of, say, like Immanuel Kant. So just a reminder, again, we've already sort of summarized this and talked about Kant's views, but just to bring it out, because Regan does, some people hold to Kant's philosophical view on this, which is that we may not have any direct duties to animals, but perhaps indirectly, if they're the property of a human being, or if they're an animal that some human being invests an interest in it, then indirectly speaking, we may have obligations to the animal for the sake of the human who, cares about it, or who has some umbrella of interest that applies to it. So, like if you have a dog, I'm not supposed to kick your dog, not for the dog's sake, but on this Kantian type indirect duty view, it's for your sake, not just for the fact that I might end up behaving in a way that's abusive more generally to humans later, but other indirect duty view authors and advocates will say that it could also just be thought of in the simple case of like how you have an interest in the animal if that is your possession. So if I was to kick the animal, it's like kind of like harming your property. And that means that I'm doing some indirectly harm to you, a human being. So this grounds all the value and obligations in human-to-human relations, but just says that animals can be intermingled into those human-to-human relations because sometimes we'll, have them as pets. And in those cases, that's what gives them some different moral standing than an animal that's like on a factory farm who nobody has a sentimental attachment to and who nobody is interested in for a moral or property-based reason protecting. So as an analogy, if you had a car, and I think I used this analogy when I introduced the concept last couple times, but to bring it back one more time. If you have a car and I break the windshield, it's not a direct harm to the car or the windshield because it's not a moral being and it can't make judgments. But some people believe that, of course, if I make that damage happen to the car, I'm indirectly harming you. So the car has moral status. It should be free from attack, not for its own sake, but for the sake of the owner who's a moral being who I have to respect. In the same way, you could say the animal that some person owns or has interests in is not valued for its own sake, but it should be treated properly because of the rights extended onto it from its owner or from those that do invest an interest in it. So some people hold that indirect duty view, but now let's hear Regan's opposition back. Regan says, why should we believe this? Because a windshield is not like an animal, and a windshield cannot sense or feel anything. It's not the subject of a life. So of course you can't wrong it in a direct sense, and it could only be looked at as having indirect moral standing because of a person that cares about it or owns it as property. But an animal, again, he returns to his point, can suffer, can feel, and can perceive, and is interested in avoiding pain. So you can't really compare, he thinks, by analogy, property of inanimate objects with property, if you want to call it that, of a living thing, because it's the subject of a life. You can't deny that they have feelings, he says. That would be no intelligent person would say they can't even feel the pain. Maybe you think it's only human pain that matters morally. But again, he finds that unreasonable because pain is pain. We all know how bad it is to feel it. And so he thinks that if it's wrong to inflict it on a human, it's wrong to do it to a sensitive animal as well. Now, there are other views that those which deny animal rights try to express. Perhaps a more sophisticated variation on the indirect duty view is the contractarian view. So here we go, contractarianism. So the contractarian view says that rights are like contracts. So only those which are capable of engaging in contracts can have rights. This is similar to Carl Cohen and to some degree Kantian thought, which says that lacking in moral judgment or the ability to make moral claims, animals would therefore not be members of the moral community or have rights. The contractarian view is just in that same kind of family of thought. It says To have rights, a being must be able to enter into contracts. So that's another standpoint that those which oppose animal rights can argue from. You can say the reason that it's morally justified and legitimate to treat animals as we do at the agricultural animal agriculture scale is because they are not the sort of beings that can possibly enter into contracts. Some people think that morality and the moral community is sort of just some quasi contract system. Although it's not an explicit contract that you literally sign, sign on the dotted line and agree to a set of terms, we can see it in some extended sense as comparable to that because, for example, in the case of a contract, you agree that you're obligated to adhere to certain conditions of the contract, and in exchange, you get certain benefits back, which gives you a motive to sign it. So if I signed a contract of employment, it might say, here are the hours you're expected to work, here are the duties that you're expected to perform, and in exchange, you're going to receive this kind of compensation and benefits, okay? So it's a contract, it's an expected agreement between two parties, which limits both of their freedoms, but also imposes certain kind of benefits as well as obligations. Now, animals, of course, could never comprehend what a contract is. They can never evaluate the reciprocity of obligations and rights that come from having the contract signed. So they could never live up to their part in an agreement, nor could they be expected to enforce the terms of such agreements on either side of the compact between the two parties. So, ethics sometimes people think is like a contract type system because you could say, well, in exchange for me honoring your right to life, I expect you to do the same for me. And if we both feel that way, we're both going to refrain from violating each other's rights on the tacit assumption that our own rights will be upheld. That widespread pattern of behavior gets us all on the same page, more or less morally, with a few deviants that act outside of the norms. So it takes an intellectually capable and advanced being like a human that has language and abstract thought to comprehend what contracts are and to understand how they could relate to your obligations and duties. So that's another view. What about that? That's another opposing view to animal rights, the view of our author today. On the contractarian standard, here's his response, which I think you probably understand since we've already seen it in a few other cases. His reply is that contractarian views are mistaken because they cannot, at the end of the day, even fully cover under the moral community all human beings, all Homo sapiens like ourselves. Because the contract approach says morality depends on a kind of general agreement, and there are some people who couldn't possibly engage in contracts either. So people could, in theory, exclude certain humans from the moral community just because they're not capable of engaging in abstract thought or signing contracts. Little children that are infants and toddlers, they could never agree to a contract or understand what it meant. And some mentally disabled human beings also would fit into that category, or maybe the very senile. Do we want to say that they could be used for medical experiments against their will because they can't engage in contracts, if that was the basis on which membership in the moral community depended? So the problem he sees is that the contractarian standard, like any other intellectually robust standard, is going to cut off from the moral community even certain humans. And since he knows that we're not inclined to disavow their moral standing or status for consistency's purpose and sake, we should not say that that same criteria applies only to animals but not to human beings. Now, there are some contractarians that try to evade his pushback on this by having a slightly more sophisticated version of the contractarian view. And that I'll just briefly mention. It's an idea that was first written about by another author named John Rawls. John Rawls is considered one of the great ethical philosophers of the 20th century. That's the last century, the 1900s. And he had this doctrine known as the veil of ignorance. So let me try my best to explain the veil of ignorance concept. This was a hypothetical that the author argued for. He said that if this set of conditions was possible, which of course in reality it's not, but if somehow this condition was possible, he thinks that it would lead to the formation of a perfectly just society. Okay, so here was his hypothetical requirement for forming the rules of a perfect just society. He said you have to make sure that all the people who framed the Constitution or the rules for the society, right, the established rules and laws that are going to exist going forward, place them behind a quote unquote veil of ignorance. And here's what that would be. The veil of ignorance is this hypothetical concept of when you're behind the veil, you are deprived of all knowledge about your own identity. So when you're within the veil, you don't know your gender, you don't know your, socioeconomic status, your race, you don't know your orientation, or your religion, or your political philosophy. So like you're temporarily ignorant, to coin the phrase, of any fact about yourself. All you have is the ability to use reason to establish rules. Okay, so why would that lead to the most fair and just society if everyone that was making and crafting the rules was behind the veil of ignorance? Well, because then they would be making sure, right, that whatever rules they instituted would not have a disadvantageous impact on any particular subcategory of people in society. Because, right, like suppose that you crafted the rules for society and you said, oh, men get everything and women, they just don't get any benefits or rights and they just have to work for the men who get to chill all day. If that's the rules that you created, but you didn't know if you would be a man or woman, you'd be scared that once the veil was removed, you're like, oh, damn, I'm a woman now. And so I build all these rules that harm women, but I end up being one. So you would be like especially concerned that like the outcomes in the society would not favor or disfavor any particular type of person, because you would be completely like self-interested in protecting every person to the maximum extent possible, so that in case you were that type of person, your rules would not have negatively hurt you. You understand? So like this veil of ignorance thought. Anyway, how can it relate back to our bigger argument? Some people say, again, that animals don't have rights because they can't enter into contracts. And some people then say, well, contractarianism is bad because according to contractarianism, couldn't the members of society like agree to exclude even other human beings? Like they could say, well, under our contracted rules, women get no rights, or gay people get no rights, or something. The veil of ignorance variation on this is supposed to try and make the rules a little bit more stable and fair, because at least then you know that the framers of the rules would have their own, liability to disadvantage to worry about. And wouldn't that make sure that the rules would be just and fair? But again, the author Regan, today's author, he doesn't even think that this veil of ignorance thing helps very much, because he says still the people who would be making the rules would know this much. Well, I'm a rational person because I'm able to contemplate these rules, and therefore they could still build in exclusions to the mentally disabled, to the infants, to the exceptionally senile or whatever, and of course to non-human animals by extension, because they're on the intellectual level of some of those cases. So he says, although the veil of ignorance might make sure to ensure broad fairness in society among the fully rational members of it, of whatever description, it couldn't necessarily ensure the proper treatment of those that don't have reason, even in the human community. So once again, contractarianism does some work to try and distinguish between the rights of humans and the rights of non-contracting, non-rational animals. But the same kind of razor that cuts off the animals from the moral community on this basis would cleave off as well certain non-rational humans in the categories we've mentioned. And since that is unacceptable, he thinks we should just have to reject this position altogether for those reasons. Another view which denies that animals have rights is the cruelty-kindness view. The cruelty-kindness view says, okay, maybe animals don't have any rights, but perhaps even without rights, we should just generally be kind to them and not cruel. We have a direct, or let's just say some moral duty to be kind and not cruel, but not the same thing as them having rights. So we could make use of them for our purposes. We could use them as a means We could treat them as things with instrumental value, but all the way through it, let's try to be as kind as possible and as less cruel as possible. But once again, Regan dismisses this pretty quickly. He says, I don't see how that could be sufficient for the right treatment of someone, because, for example, cruelty and kindness is underspecified in terms of what behavior it permits. Maybe I'm being kind to somebody, but I'm lying to them. Is that morally acceptable? Maybe I'm being cruel to somebody, but I'm doing it because it's necessary to get to the right moral outcome. So just because a person is being kind doesn't ensure that what they're doing is right. Maybe somebody's being very kind to fellow Confederates in in a racist community. In that case, even if it's kindness, is the behavior that is elicited from it good behavior? On the other hand, maybe somebody performs, like the executioner at the death chamber in a maximum security prison where there is a death row. You might say the behavior is cruel, but it's not done with malice or ill intent. It's done as an administrator of justice. Or maybe you could say the behavior of some court bailiffs detaining people that get out of control in court with force, sometimes in a way that might be considered brutal or cruel, but they do it in adherence to the law. So anyway, what I'm saying is cruel behavior is not always immoral. Kind behavior is not always moral. So he doesn't think that this gives us a clear enough intuition about how we ought to be treating the animals. And so again, we should revert to something with more structure and content, which is just treating them with rights. So another anti-rights view is simply utilitarianism itself. And that one I want us to focus on for just a minute, because that's an interesting area where he even departs from, say, Peter Singer, even though they both believe that animals have some kind of moral standing. Regan is more strident in his position because he thinks they have full-on rights, whereas Singer just says, no, they don't have rights, but they just have the ability to suffer, feel pain and pleasure, and we should give equal consideration to their interest in avoiding the pain. But utilitarianism in itself does not believe that animals have rights. It just believes that their pain and pleasure should be weighed in determinations about how to treat them. But notice this. On a utilitarian theoretical view, you still can make use of the animals as long as the payout of total happiness exceeds the pain the animals suffer compared to the alternative of not having used the animal in that way. And so you could argue that, I don't know, if the value of the experiments that we conduct on the animals was sufficiently large, then, like, say, Cohen had argued, that would make it fair to test on them and do experiments on them because of the massive utilitarian benefits and total human and just total happiness and pleasure for human and non-human animals that is a consequence of doing that. So utilitarianism doesn't go so far as to say animals have rights. It just says they shouldn't be made to suffer excessively for trivial or minor benefits, but if the benefits are massive and significant enough, then that actually could provide at least a conceivable defense morally of animal practices that use them as means or that treat them as instruments. So anyway, utilitarianism permits the treatment of animals as though they just have instrumental value. It just might include some requirement to consider their pain and pleasure in that. And this is one area where I want to pause for a moment just to make a point, because it could be helpful for those that are thinking about, your essays that you're writing. I know it says in there, compare the different views of the authors and say how they're more or less Kantian or utilitarian. We know that Singer is basically utilitarian. He talks about equal consideration of interest, but the relevant interest is interest in avoiding pain and suffering. And from there, it's basically all utilitarian-minded. Like, they can suffer and feel pain and pleasure, so let's weigh that equally, and that would lead to reforms of our current status quo and treatment. Cohen had two-pronged argument. He was like, well, on the one hand, they don't have rights because they don't have the ability to make claims, and that part's more Kantian in nature because it's deontological. It's denying rights holding status to beings that can't reason or legislate the moral law. The end of Cohen's paper is a little more utilitarian, where he says that given that they may be used as means, the benefits in the end of using them as means far outweigh the total benefits if we hadn't used them as those same means, because in his view, the values derived from the tests are exceptionally large. And then Kant himself, of course, he's the Kantian, so he says they've got no rights, but they have some indirect duties that we should show to them. No rights. Why? Because they lack reason and moral self-autonomy and governance, but some degree of at least gentle treatment and unnecessary cruelness should be avoided because we have indirect duties. We don't want to poison our condition of temperament and behavior towards humans. Now, concerning Regan, if you've been looking at what he's saying here, he's no utilitarian at all. He's not a utilitarian. He rejects utilitarianism because utilitarianism does not establish what he's trying to establish, which is that animals have rights on the mere basis that they are subjects of a life. If something has inherent value, then it should not be considered in any utilitarian calculation about, well, how much benefit could we derive from using it as an instrument. So really what Regan represents, guys, is he's a Kantian in his moral thinking, except he departs from Kant himself on one point. So he embraces Kant's philosophy expressed in the categorical imperative, which says that you should never treat others as a means to an end, always as an end in itself. Except Regan believes that that principle can be and should be applied not just to humans who have rationality and who are morally self-governing, but that should also be extended to animals and all subjects of a life. So he agrees with the spirit, but not exactly the letter of Kant's own philosophy. In spirit, he agrees with Kant because he believes that if something's a member of the moral community, then it should be treated as an end in itself and never used as an instrument for the attainment of some purpose at its expense, right? So that's what it means not to treat others as a means. But Kant was specific that he thought that status only pertains to fellow rational creatures, fellow creatures capable of self-consciousness and moral self-legislation, self-governance. So he embraces the categorical imperative, does Regan, but he thinks that that categorical imperative should not only pertain to other humans, but to all subjects of a life. So hopefully you understand how in that sense, he's kind of like a neo-Kantian. He takes Kant's philosophy and he does a little twist with it. He takes the categorical imperative part and he runs with it, but he says that it should be applied more broadly, not only to things which are merely rational, but to anything that is, well, I should say not specifically rational, but to things that are merely subjects of a life. But more on why he rejects the utilitarian view. Now we're going to get into further critiques that he makes of it. In his view, utilitarian ethics just doesn't go far enough because utilitarians place moral value. They place moral value on the feelings of happiness and pleasure, not on the beings who have the feelings of happiness and pleasure. And he thinks that our common sense moral intuitions would not side with that position if you just reflect on it a little bit. So here's why he finds problems with utilitarianism. Regan's major problem with utilitarianism. To understand Regan's problem with utilitarianism, we're going to consider a couple of hypothetical scenarios that he uses to make this point. So okay, so one example he gives to make this point is the case of a hypothetical subject he calls Aunt B. All right, Aunt B, like your aunt and uncle, but her name is B. I don't know, Beatrice or something, shortened to B. Now here's the situation of Aunt B in our little narrative. I want you guys to understand that Aunt B is not very nice, and nobody really likes her. She's mean, she's nasty, she's maybe verbally abusive to people, and just really rude and not well liked by anybody. Okay, and in fact, if she was to die, it's not going to make anybody that unhappy. Sorry to say, she's just that unpleasant to everybody. Now she has a nephew, okay, nephew of the aunt, and this nephew hates his aunt just like everybody else does, but he's in line for a big inheritance. Suppose that he's in line for a big inheritance, but she's talking about changing her will so that nobody gets any of her money. If she's going to die within the next month before the will is changed, then it will all go to the nephew. And if nothing happens to her in that month, let's suppose, then she's going to be, I don't know, it's going to go to something else. Or maybe, let's just say it'll go to something ridiculous, like she just wants to be buried with it, or she wants to turn it into jewelry that's going to be put on her body when she's buried. So nobody likes her much anyway. And he's in line for an inheritance. So, question, here's what he's thinking. Before I pose this question, he's thinking, okay, well, look, suppose I was to kill my aunt. Let's just get it out there. If I kill her, then the inheritance will come down to me, and I'm going to use the inheritance to do a lot of good in the world. I'm going to help build a children's hospital in the third world, or maybe I want to donate a massive amount of money to cancer research, or to you name it, some noble cause that's going to maybe like save a lot of lives. Okay, well, that means that there might be more total utility from the transfer of wealth to him than in case she doesn't die in that time frame. Because if she dies in that time frame, all that's going to happen with all this money is it's just going to go to her grave. But if she does die before then maybe we're going to save hundreds of lives by building these facilities and making these donations. So if it was just measured in terms of cost benefit for the overall amount of total human happiness, it sounds like maybe he ought to actually kill his Aunt Bee. But now we come back to you and me, the readers. Given this example, do you really think that that's morally permitted? Most of us would probably say absolutely not. It doesn't matter whether or not this could lead to more total happiness, because she absolutely has a right to live, since she's a subject of a life, since she has inherent moral value. It doesn't matter whether she's useful to anyone else. Even if she's the opposite of useful to everyone else, she has a right to live and to be treated with certain type of dignity, just because she's what? Some people might say just because she's a human being. But this author thinks that it's just because she's the subject of a life. So if we live just by utilitarianism, he doesn't even think we could properly establish the reason that Aunt Bee, for example, has a right not to be killed here. Because, you can't necessarily argue that it's going to derive more total human happiness for him to not kill her. So if you side with the intuition that would be wrong, he says you must not be a full utilitarian in your moral thinking. You must think that there are some things that matter morally aside from just pure estimations of total happiness versus unhappiness. And that's why he thinks that the rights-based view of morality is the correct view, the one that he sides with, and the one that he thinks it's appropriate to apply to animals too. So obviously, utilitarianism is not a view that recognizes absolute human rights, and to that extent, it's wrong according to Regan. Another example that he uses to make the same point is this example of a cup filled with liquid. Okay, so suppose there's this cup like this, and there's liquid inside of it. What this liquid represents is, let's just say it's a symbol for happiness and pleasure. The more of this cup liquid there's more happiness in the cup. The less liquid, the less happiness. Now, this is now a metaphor. The cup is like a person, or just a being, right? A living thing. And the liquid is the total amount of happiness or unhappiness that it's possessing. Now, suppose that if we broke this one cup, okay, and destroyed it, spilling all of its contents, that would diminish the total amount of happiness here. But suppose that it would cause like 3 or 4 other cups to increase in the total level of fluid that they contained to a volume that added up to more than this cup was holding at first. So I'm basically saying we break one cup, spilling its content, but in 4 others, that causes the volume of each to increase by a total amount that surpasses what this cup was holding. So it's a net gain of the liquid. If this liquid was to happiness and unhappiness, then what should we do? Break the cup, because then we'll get more happiness, more total happiness. But as applied to human beings, this is like saying that if killing one person and destroying them causes more total happiness for everybody else, then that's something that we ought to do. But again, Regan questions the whole premise of this way of looking at ethics. He says, why should we be prioritizing the value of the fluid within the cup and not the cup itself? So by extension, in utilitarianism, is it you and me and other members of the moral community that have ultimate value, or the pleasure and pain that we can experience? And in utilitarianism anyway, it's not the individuals who can feel the pleasure or pain who have value invested in them, but it is the feelings of pleasure and pain themselves which are accorded moral value. So, he thinks that that's absolutely wrong, because we have to place value directly on the beings that are experiencing the pleasure and pain, not just the feelings of pleasure and pain themselves. So again, the utilitarian type of moral view, it just runs into a wall, he thinks, when it comes back to your common sense and you compare it to your common sense. It would say, perhaps, that you should kill this aunt because that's going to lead to more total happiness than not doing so. Or that you should destroy this cup, which is by metaphor like a case of killing a person, to generate more value for everyone else. But it looks like he thinks we're getting our priorities backwards, caring more about the happiness or unhappiness in the abstract than on the actual individuals who are the bearers of these feelings of happiness or unhappiness. So instead of all that, he says, no. The reason that you think this is wrong is because you believe Aunt B has inherent value. She's not just valuable as a thing that has some usefulness to other people or lack thereof. And the cut point is supposed to make a similar point, that we should invest things that have moral value and standing with inherent value, regardless of their values to others or regardless of their ability to make other people happy or not. So if we have that type of value, we have it inherently, and we have it regardless of our differences, and that means we have got rights. But again, he's saying it's not just humans that have these rights, but any subject of a life. And he thinks this is attractive as an alternative to contractarianism or utilitarianism because it's granting us rights in principle. It's not just granting us rights to the extent that we can feel pleasure and pain. Or it's not just granting us rights to the extent that we're capable of engaging in contracts, which, as we know, some humans wouldn't be able to do. It grants you rights in principle on the mere basis that you are the subject of a life. And that's something that we can have universally in common across the whole human community, but also with respect to non-human animals too. So that's the best view, the rights-based view. It grants rights and moral standing in principle to all beings that are subjects of the life, not only to those with higher level cognitive capacities like contracting ability, reason, tool use, or what have you. Now, again, he's saying that this extends beyond the human realm to animals too. He says we cannot limit rights just to humans. Yes, he reminds us that animals lack many abilities that adult, mature humans do have, yes. But so do many humans lack those abilities of mature adults, like, for example, toddlers and infants, or the mentally disabled. In the human case, to repeat the point, we don't think of those deficiencies as a basis to deny equal rights or equally inherent value. So he thinks that we'll get to the proper moral treatment of animals when we consider the way that we're more similar to them instead of all the ways that we're different. We do that with the not high-functioning, intellectually disabled humans. We don't say, well, they don't function on our level intellectually, so let's exclude them from moral concern. We instead focus on the similarities that we have with them. Now, what are the similarities? What is the key similarity that we bear, not just with our disabled human friends, but with animals, non-human animals? The key similarity he returns back to is that we are all the experiencing subjects of a life. We're all conscious, concerned about our own individual welfare in countless ways. We don't want to be feeling pain. We want our lives to continue. So we have those facts in common, he thinks, with animals. They, just as much as us, therefore have full and equal rights and inherent moral value. To say that only humans have it would force you to point out a non-arbitrary difference between us and them, but he reminds you that for any such distinction that you might cite, there are going to be at least some humans who lack those characteristics as well, either because of the congenital deficiency or through some injury or illness that they exposed to later. And some of us, by the way, that are currently well-functioning cognitively could fall into a lower cognitively functioning position at some future time, since we regard those things as sacrosanct, the rights of humans, even when they don't have full intellectual capacities any longer or never would. He thinks that we should show the same kind of inherent moral standing to animals who, such like those humans mentioned, are subjects of a life. Now, who are subjects of a life? You might be thinking, does it apply to little bugs and tiny insects? If I'm stepping on them, am I committing the same kind of wrong as if I killed a full-on a bigger animal or a human? Well, he's comfortable saying that if you go far enough down the tree of life on the phylogenetic tree, you might get to stuff that's not the subject of life in the way that he's described. I mean, what is really the consciousness like of, say, like an ant in comparison to that of a vertebrate or even invertebrate terrestrial or aquatic life form? It might be that if we go into unsophisticated enough forms of life, there may be comparatively little sentience or little sensation even. And at those levels, he's not necessarily making claims about their moral standing. But the animals that are actually used by humans for the most part in like food and industrial agriculture, animal agriculture, and experiments are, you know, pigs, cows, chickens, etc., which do, of course, have the higher cognitive functioning that at least makes them subjects of a life. So even if he's willing to excludes some members of the animal world from his moral argument. He thinks that it applies generally to all those that are actually used by humans in the mainstream for food and etc. They're the subjects of a life, even if maybe not a little, I don't know, pollywog or tiny ant. So again, he grants that some lower animals may not have a life in the aforementioned sense, but that's not really relevant because the animals of interest in terms of human to animal exploitation certainly do. So if all that's true, what he's saying, then yes, he thinks it's wrong to use animals even in humane ways because it's a violation of the rights of these subjects of a life. And so an easy test to sort of run through to check on whether something would be wrong to do to an animal, in Regan's view, ask yourself, if that act would be wrong to do to a human being, then you already have your answer. It would be wrong to do to an animal also. So, of course, we know there's a lot of things that we would not accept being done to humans of any type, whether it's coerced medical experiments, using humans for food, or dairy milk, or things of that kind. So that would be wrong to do to animals too. But we've run through yet another author. We've heard from Tom Regan. Again, he's kind of like an interesting mix of Kantian views with a twist. He's a pro-animal author who argues not just on the basis of their considerability due to their ability to suffer pain, as a utilitarian might have argued in favor of, but more stridently that they have rights. So even if not exposed to painful stimuli, using them as means is wrong because they're not only things with instrumental value. And okay, so I'm happy you guys were able to watch this one. Keep watching. We just have a couple of more meetings before we're getting prepped for our last week of classes. You're working right now on your essays for the following week, and I've already distributed a study guide for the final two. So I'm going to let you go for now. Happy to have you guys with me as usual, and I'll see you soon. If you need anything, please be in touch. But all right, take care.